This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team. Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis, a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm a student in psychology at the University of Queensland.
And I'm Louisa Parks. I'm a associate professor of political sociology at the University of Trento in Italy.
And we are in part 2 of our discussion of chapter 27 of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements, which is about framing in the environmental movements and is written by Professor Parks. And we were really just talking at the end of part 1 about the relationship of identity to frames and how people that might have the same identity as environmentalists might actually have different frames at different points in time. And that's actually an incredibly fascinating process, how the frames form and change. Can you talk a little more about that?
I can try. So the relationship between sort of sharing frames of action or frames of problem diagnosis and problem prognosis, the way that's linked to holding a particular identity, and in particular a shared collective identity, is actually not particularly clear right now in the scholarly literature. Different people have different ideas about how having a shared frame links to something much stronger, which is a collective identity, right? So you as psychologists, of course, understand the identity side of this much more than I do, but it doesn't seem necessarily that they're not, synonymous with one another. So I could share with somebody with a very different identity to myself a belief about what we need to do to act on climate change, for example, with somebody who votes for a different political party, with somebody from a different country, etc. So I think for shared frames, collective action frames, the question is really about, are they somehow building blocks for collective identity? It doesn't really look like that. It looks like collective identity is a much more visceral, personal thing that's built in social interaction, whereas frames for collective action are what would get me out of bed and onto the street, perhaps for the first time or second time, etc. It's also about the impacts of collective action. So a big question is, what we're seeing in the literature at the moment, particularly on European youth movements for the climate, Fridays for Future and the school strikes, etc., is that different people taking part in those marches have quite different ideas about who should be acting to solve problems of environmental degradation, and where responsibility lies and what needs to change. So what we tend to see is that younger people in those European movements talk more about individual level change, lifestyle change, as something political, so not as something apolitical, but something that would lead to a change in society, let's say. And they talk about, politicians need to take more responsibility, states need to do more, including in their roles in international organizations, for example, by listening to the science, right? Comprehending the urgency and acting accordingly. Whereas when we look at older cohorts within those protests, they tend to talk a lot more about systemic change, that lifestyle change is important, but it's important because we need to live coherently, but it's very much acknowledging that the systems we live within make it very hard to act ecologically at the individual level a lot of the time, because we need to get to work and there's no mass transport system, for example. The various constraints on our lives, when it's hot and there is no public water fountain and you're obliged to get a bottle of water or something like this. So those differences are something that are being debated at the moment, also in terms of movement building. So we talked about that big master frame of environmental justice or climate justice and how lots of different kinds of groups and activism can come under that umbrella. But are they too disparate? Are they too differentiated? Do they believe in such different solutions about what needs to be done that they can't effectively work together, or at least be seen as a movement that will have political effects, even at the global level, national levels, local levels, etc.? So there's a lot of debate in the literature about those very different ideas about what is wrong and what we need to do to solve it. There are lots of people with very we're seeing research that finds a lot of activists personally talk about sort of collapsism, very fatalistic ideas of there is nothing more we can do. But when I'm an activist, I talk about it in terms of hope, because that's what will get people to act. So, you know, there are these tensions between different ideas and feelings, and how and if those are connected to collective identity, and whether we really need those very strong collective identities that we thought we needed for a movement to exist, let's say pre-social media days.
That's something that you were talking about just now, Aylinda, the role of social media. What are your thoughts and questions at this point in time?
I was going to ask about the agreements and disagreements in the area, but I feel like you've kind of already addressed that a little bit. I guess I was wondering, have you explored a little bit on, you know, how activism works on a social media platform? Is that considered more on an individual level, I guess? And is there maybe discussion about like how effective that is? Or, you know, I find that in my group, there's a lot of talk of you can post online or you can share information online, but then the action kind of stops there. Like, I was wondering if that's had any effect of, you know, how activism has kind of moved right now.
I mean, I'm not a huge expert in the area, but we've definitely seen changes. I mean, I can sum up definitely the way that the literature has evolved around trying to grasp social media as a tool and as a space of activism for social movements. What we've seen is that it was without you know, social media, the internet, well, it was prior social media actually, the more transnational global movements would not have emerged, because the coordination that online communication allows across time zones, across languages, across borders, etc., has been very, very important and instrumental in linking movements up across the world. In terms of framing an identity, there is a lot of debate still going on about what this means. So we have sort of the seminal work that says exactly, it's kind of individualizing. And that means you can get a lot of people interested, but not for the same lengths of time that we used to see in more traditional street kinds of social movement processes. Is that good or bad for movements? Well, you know, it can be a bit of both. It very much depends. Getting a lot of online attraction has often translated into very big real world protest as well. So we tend to find that people who are active online are also active offline. They're not mutually exclusive things. Yeah. It's also freed up a lot of people to take part at the level of commitment that they can, right? Given whatever their personal situation is. So it allows you to dip into activism in a way that perhaps wasn't possible before, if you had to go to meetings and commit and organize, and things were a lot more complex. But it's definitely a field where what we're understanding what it means for the way that individuals interpret frames, the way that individuals build connections between themselves is very much an evolving field. And I won't say more because I'm not an expert enough in it.
That's so good. Thank you.
It certainly seems to highlight differences of opinion, and maybe that's, you know, a sign of the times that, you know, I'm talking about, well, maybe we should look a bit you know, how much we can disagree but still act together.
In our field, in collective action social psychology, we have really spent a lot of time on groups and social identities. And the tendency at first was very much to look at social categories, the big collective identities that I think you're referring to, like the nation or religion as the core group. But now I think a lot of us have moved to look at the more ephemeral, but also powerful concept of opinion group identities. So this is the idea that I can identify as a supporter of a cause, the Black Lives Matter movement or the environmental movement. And that is an identity that can immediately connect with behavior. So the normative, actions of my movement, as soon as I take up a supporter identity, I can engage in those actions. And that can include those online actions like, changing your Facebook frame or, changing the color of your Twitter background to yellow and blue or anything like that. But it can also connect in to donations and marches and voting, and even to other forms of action like radical actions, all the way, to online radicalization to terrorism. And it's interesting because what we know from the literature on social identity and norms is that when you have an existing identity and a contested one, like the nation state or your religion, then in fact, the norms for behaviors are on the whole more stable and less likely to shift towards volatile direct action or radical action or new forms of contestation. But when you have a new identity, or taking a step back, we know from the radicalization literature that converts are much more likely to take up, say, terrorism. Converts to a religion up to 10 or more times more likely to embrace terrorism. Why? Because they don't have the existing behavioral norms that a person raised in the faith would have. So, to someone who's raised in the faith, for example, a Christian goes to church and prays, and it takes a certain amount of disconnection from that to leapfrog into embracing a Christian identity that's about shooting up people in a mosque. But at the same time, when we look at those supporter identities, many of them are very volatile, and they come up on the internet. So you might support, action to protest against a particular incident that's gone viral, or, Cyril the lion who was killed, shamefully a few years ago, and that went viral on the internet. And so there's a potential for an emergent identity with local norms. And the concept that I was very interested in, that you brought up in the chapter, is this idea of the discursive space and the discursive opportunity structure. So the idea here, as I understood it, is that yes, these identities can form and they can link in with new actions that people might never have taken before, that they suddenly feel like they can feel empowered to take. But at the same time, there's a broader narrative structure of society about who we are and what we do. There are kind of opportunity structures where this identity entrepreneurship can take place, but there are limits. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I think might be interesting in terms of, taking ideas of framing and discursive fields, etc., forward is exactly this idea. So we were talking about, the different ideas of different age cohorts, for example, in some protests under Fridays for Future. Don't want to generalize to whole movements, because we can't do that, right? We know about those protests and those people, but there seems to be, there are ways of seeing environmental crisis, climate crisis, etc., that are very much linked to the discursive field, the dominant norms, the general discourses, the common sense, if you like, about what we should be doing about the climate crisis that exists in society. Now, if we switch focus for a moment and we think about the literature that talks about the way that, for example, international environmental law has developed, building on those dominant understandings of the world, those dominant understandings of the world are precisely those colonial ones we were talking about in the first part of the video. So a view of the world as a set of resources to be used by certain people on the planet. the fact that, we should exploit those resources, and those resources sometimes include, indigenous people, people of color, etc., for, economic purposes, essentially. So there is a whole, body of critical literature that says that these are the fundamental ideas that we've built all of our law and governance on, and that includes environmental law and governance. That the way we imagine solutions comes from our understanding of economic growth as a quite important thing for humans, which of course it is, right? That's not necessarily wrong, but it closes off space. Discourses necessarily close off spaces for other ideas.
I'm not sure if everyone's even going to know what a discourse is. Would you give a definition of that?
So a discourse would be, this is a tricky one as well, because there is lots of different ideas about what discourse is.
I feel like we're getting her down, Linda. We're winning. No, I'm just kidding.
For me, a discourse is kind of like a well-known script, right? It's the way that I immediately understand this is how things are done, right? So the way I try and explain it to students is that for some reason, when you walk into a lecture theatre at university, it's not a cinema and you act accordingly. You don't go into the lecture theatre with popcorn and, lie back and, oh, well, maybe somebody does, but, they're challenging the discourse. You have information in your life that tells you how to interpret situations, and those are discourses. It's how we're supposed to behave.
Is that the same as a discourse and a norm? Is that like, could you use that, like, how is that different or similar?
I'm thinking, sorry to jump in, it's like our psychological concept, which is actually called scripts. So a script is a set of norms for a sequence of actions in a context. So in the example of the cinema, the individual norms could be like, first you buy the ticket, and then you buy the popcorn, and then you go and sit down and you have to turn off your cell phone. So it's like the script is these 4 norms in this order, in this space. And so that the discourse example extends more broadly, if I understand correctly, to in our society today, this is what we're doing. And, this is how we would approach changing the social system. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. That's exactly how I understand it, at least, in my limit, is that it's sort of higher order ideas that are made up of a series of norms, let's say. And the sort of big discourses that guide environmental law, critical authors argue, are that we should solve it through economic instruments, right? Market instruments. We hear a lot about, green economy and just transitions, and they're all quite economically oriented. We talk about valuing nature, putting price tags on natural ecosystem services, things like this. And this seems to be a kind of dominant discourse that then we see maybe in some of the ideas of movement activists, that states should act, that we should have more green jobs, that we should change our consumption patterns, that it's about the way we use our economic power that is going to change this problem. More critical and challenging ideas there are, maybe economic approaches, we should understand those as what created this problem in the first place. And to solve that problem, we can't look to the source of the problem itself. We have to overturn, we have to flip. And that's where some authors say that actually the more challenging parts of social movements and the way they frame environmental problems are really important, because they introduce these new and quite radical, in the sense of, not connected to dominant norms and discourses. Those kinds of ideas need to come from somewhere to create change in environmental governance. And that's why activism and collective action and the framing work of collective actors is so important. And that's why it's important for us to understand what's going on in this very broad range of different ideas that come out of different parts of the movement, and which ones are taking the, say the upper hand, or are more visible or are the ones that are making it into official discourses. So in some of my work, for example, I've taken the ideas of Indigenous activists and tried to see where they find some space in the discourses of global environmental governance bodies, for example. And that's quite a long tradition in framing work as well, has been how do the ideas of collective actors find a reflection in the media, in politics, in governance processes, I don't know, in company corporate responsibility documents, you name it.
It's really interesting. It connects in with our research in psychology, of course, and persuasion and influence and stickiness. But the difference is that there's as you say, a tension between understanding frames as something that change individual attitudes and actions and perceptions, and frames as collectively developed and contested in factions, put forward by groups, embraced by movements. And I think that that is an important direction of future research that you highlight in the chapter. Did you guys all get struck silent by what I just said? Okay, well, maybe
I have no answers yet, but
yeah. Well, maybe let's look at wrapping up this part 2, since we did have a moment of startled silence. I want to just come back to my point that I made at the end of part 1, that I think this concept of framing kind of unites the psychology of collective action with the history, the politics, the economics, the sociology. It really is a concept and a body of work that not just talks about the creation of knowledge and meaning and interpretation, but can be a lens for the study of the creation of meaning. And I was really excited to read it. I learned heaps, and I recommend it to all my students, that's for sure. Linda, what was your, do you have any final thoughts at this point, or final questions?
No, I'm okay. I really enjoyed watching you both talk about that. That was great. So I really look forward to reading the chapter again in a new light. So thank you so much.
That's great. And what about you, Louisa? Would you like to take us out, with one last word of wisdom?
Oh, I'm not sure I have words of wisdom, but don't forget about, you know, how what you think might be able to change the world. There you go.
Well done. All right. Well, thank you again to yourself, Professor Parks, for being here today, and to Linda for participating in the recording. Well done. And thank you to all of our viewers, especially those that have watched part 1 and part 2. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.